Chapter 12. What really happened on September 11th? The incident. On September 11th, 2001, 4 airplanes were hijacked on American soil and crashed into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania. The official word. The 19 hijackers were all fanatic Muslim terrorists linked to Al-Qaeda and its ringleader, Osama bin Laden. My take? Our government engaged in a massive cover-up of what really happened, including its own ties to the hijackers. Unanswered questions remain about how the towers were brought down and whether a plane really struck the Pentagon. The Bush administration either knew about the plan and allowed it to proceed, or they had a hand in it themselves. The truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is. Winston Churchill. I was in my 3rd year as Minnesota's governor on September 11th, 2001. After the devastation of the Pentagon being hit and the Twin Towers falling, I put the National Guard on alert and secured some of our public buildings. The following Sunday morning, we were the first state to hold a memorial for the nearly 3,000 victims. More than 40,000 people showed up on the front lawn of the state capitol, while a steady rain fell. I'll never forget Native American shamans beating drums alongside honor guards who represented the police and firefighters and military. It still chokes me up to think about it. Looking out on hundreds of flags fluttering in the breeze, I remember saying at the end of 2 hours, "We will promote good against evil, and finally we will together restore our sense of freedom by conquering this enemy." I never wanted to believe anything different than what our government told us about that tragic day. But here is what John Farmer, a senior counsel for the 9/11 Commission, who drafted the original report, has to say in a new book. At some level of the government, at some point in time, there was an agreement not to tell the truth about what happened. What more do we need? Are we willing to live with another lie to go with the Warren Report, the Iran-Contra cover-up, and many other official stories? I certainly never expected to think that elements of the Bush administration were complicit with the enemy. Today, though, I am convinced that some people inside our government knew the attack was going to happen and allowed it to come to pass because it furthered their political agenda. I don't necessarily believe that they orchestrated it themselves, although the door is definitely open to that. I say this after expending many hours researching things about the official story that don't add up, and interviewing a number of witnesses with first-hand knowledge that contradicts what we were told. As a patriotic American, I say this with a heavy heart, and with an outrage that really knows no words. But it's something we, as a nation, must come to terms with. Otherwise, it could happen again. From day one, there was something that puzzled me. You had 4 airplanes being hijacked on the same morning. Maybe the first one snuck by the radar, but the next 3? I'd been inside air traffic control, where you've got a dozen people watching every plane in their sector. They know what direction all the aircraft are supposed to be going, and here were 4 planes going directly opposite of their normal flight path. But we're supposed to believe that no alarm bells went off anywhere, so no fighter jets got scrambled to intercept the planes. Was everybody asleep at the switch? How could the FAA and our air defenses experience such a miserable failure? I want to tell you a story about a guy named Charles Lewis, who my writing colleague Dick Russell interviewed recently in Southern California. Until 2 months before September 11th, Lewis had worked at LAX as the quality control manager for Kiewit Pacific Construction on its Taxiway C project. A large part of his duties involved security in the airport operations area, or AOA. There he got to know employees of various agencies: the L.A. World Airport Police, the LAPD, and California Highway Patrol, the FBI, U.S. Customs, and others. When the 9/11 attacks occurred, Lewis was a deputy inspector for the city of L.A. during a seismic retrofit of the L.A. Hilton Towers Hotel, only a few minutes from the airport by car. After making sure the hotel construction crew went home, Lewis rushed over to LAX's Guard Post 2 because he was one of very few people who knew how to fix certain parts of the new security systems in case any problems developed. Lewis estimates he arrived at about 6:35 a.m. Pacific Time, 9:35 a.m. Eastern, not long after the second plane struck the World Trade Center. As on other days, there was chatter on LAX security walkie-talkies, and he could easily hear what they were saying, sometimes both sides of the conversation. Lewis remembers, "The first thing I noticed was that the guards, and that day they were the L.A. World Airport Police and the FBI, were very upset and agitated, because apparently no one from FAA had notified NORAD, North American Aerospace Defense Command. They were making calls and demanding to know why not. Eventually word came back that NORAD had indeed been notified, but they had been ordered to stand down. Then LAX security wanted to know who could have made that order, and word came back that it was from the highest level of the White House. Later on, watching television, I knew the order didn't come from Bush because he was reading My Pet Goat to the school kids in Florida. So the only other person it could be was Dick Cheney." It turns out there were some war games taking place that morning. September 11th was the second day of Vigilant Guardian, an exercise of the Joint Chiefs and NORAD that simulated planes being hijacked in the northeastern United States. Another drill, called Northern Vigilance, had shifted some fighter jets to Canada and Alaska to monitor Russian MiGs flying training missions. This one put phantoms on military radar screens that would look real to the participants in the exercise. We fought many phantoms that day, Richard Myers of the Joint Chiefs later testified to Congress. But could the attack have been scheduled intentionally to coincide with those war games? If so, this raises a couple of questions. Either there was a major intelligence leak, whereby the terrorists realized the war games would be a good cover for their operation, or else some people in the administration knew of the attack ahead of time and let it proceed simultaneously, knowing the confusion this would cause. Between September 2000 and June 2001, on 67 different occasions, fighter jets were sent to intercept aircraft that had lost radio contact or their transponder signal, or were flying off course, usually within 10 minutes of any sign of a problem. Contrary to what some people think, presidential approval wasn't needed to intercept or even shoot down an aircraft. Then, on June 1, 2001, the existing hijacking response procedures were changed to require approval by the Secretary of Defense before responding to a situation with lethal force. And when the call came into the Pentagon on 9/11, nobody answered the phone. The stand-down order that Charles Lewis heard about was confirmed by none other than Norman Mineta, Transportation Secretary at the time. According to the 9/11 Commission, Cheney didn't arrive underground at the PEOC, Presidential Emergency Operations Center, until almost 10 a.m. Mineta, however, said the Vice President was already down there when he arrived at about 9:20 a.m. Richard Clark and Cheney's photographer indicated the same thing. That was before the Pentagon had been hit, and Mineta recalled a young man coming into the PEOC 3 times to tell Cheney how far out the plane was from Washington. After the third report, according to Mineta, the young fellow asked, "Do the orders still stand?" And Cheney responded, "Of course the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?" The 9/11 Commission chose to ignore Mineta's testimony and went so far as to remove it from the video archive. Instead, they had Cheney ordering almost 45 minutes later than Mineta said the inbound aircraft be shot down. Except by then, all 4 planes had already gone down. That was cover-up number 1 by the 9/11 Commission. Now let's look at whether it was actually those 2 planes that were responsible for the falling towers. I was amazed watching the 2007 version of the documentary Loose Change, which I urge everyone to see, at the many firefighters and other eyewitnesses who talked about a whole series of explosions before and during the collapse of the buildings. All of this was reported on the news at the time. Before the South Tower collapsed, video footage clearly shows sizable amounts of white smoke starting to pour out of the base. There was described a giant rolling ball of flame that came up from street level, an elevator that exploded on the 65th floor as someone stood beside it, a woman on the 49th floor seeing people with burns and broken arms in the stairwells. For every window in the lobby to be exploding, it wasn't from the jet fuel, no way, according to one of the witnesses, and a whole lot more that did not jive with any plane striking the building. Barry Jennings, the city's emergency coordinator, was at the scene before and after the building collapses. Jennings puts it out there plainly. I know what I heard. I heard explosions. For my TV show, I interviewed a witness named William Rodriguez, a janitor who happened to have a master key and rescued many people and got honored at the White House as a national hero. He says that shortly before American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower at 8:46 a.m., an explosion simultaneously rocked the building so hard it pushed us up. Rodriguez later testified behind closed doors to the 9/11 Commission, but his name was never mentioned in the report. Rodriguez also gave the Commission and the FBI a list of 14 people who had been with him, but not a single one was ever contacted. He produced his boss for us, who looked me right in the eye and, in essence, told me the same story. What's happened to Rodriguez today? He's on the no-fly list, a guy who went back in to save people with no regard for his own life. When he goes somewhere, he's pulled out of the line, interrogated, harassed. All because, I guess, he didn't give the proper testimony they wanted. Some people have argued that the Twin Towers went down within a half hour of one another because of the way they were constructed. Well, those 425,000 cubic yards of concrete and 200,000 tons of steel were designed to hold up against a Boeing 707, the largest plane built at the time the towers were completed in 1973. Analysis had shown that a 707 traveling at 600 miles an hour, and those had 4 engines, would not cause major damage. The twin-engine Boeing 757s that hit on 9/11 were going 440 and 550 miles an hour. Still, we are told that a molten, highly intense fuel mixture from the planes brought down these 2 steel-framed skyscrapers. Keep in mind that no other such skyscraper in history had ever been known to collapse completely due to fire damage. So could it actually have been the result of a controlled demolition from inside the buildings? I don't claim expertise about this, but I did work 4 years as part of the Navy's underwater demolition teams, where we were trained to blow things to hell in high water. And my staff talked at some length with a prominent physicist, Stephen E. Jones, who says that a gravity-driven collapse without demolition charges defies the laws of physics. These buildings fell at nearly the rate of freefall, straight down into their own footprint in approximately 10 seconds. An object dropped from the roof of the 110-story tall towers would reach the ground in about 9.2 seconds. Then there's the fact that steel beams that weighed as much as 200,000 pounds got tossed laterally as far as 500 feet. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NISI, started its investigation on August 21, 2002. When their 10,000-page-long report came out 3 years later, the spokesman said there was no evidence to suggest a controlled demolition. But Stephen E. Jones also says that molten metal found underground weeks later is proof that jet fuel couldn't have been all that was responsible. I visited the site about 3 weeks after 9/11 with Governor Pataki and my wife, Terry. It didn't mean anything to me at the time, but they had to suspend digging that day because they were running into heat pockets of huge temperatures. These fires kept burning for more than 3 months, the longest-burning structure blaze ever. And this was all due to jet fuel? We're talking molten metal, more than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Probably the most conclusive evidence about a controlled demolition is a research paper, 2 years, 9 authors, published in the peer-reviewed Open Chemical Physics Journal in April 2009. In studying dust samples from the site, these scientists found chips of nanothermite, which is a high-tech, incendiary explosive. Here's what the paper's lead author, Dr. Niels Harrit of the University of Copenhagen's Chemistry Department, had to say about the explosive that he's convinced brought down the Twin Towers and the nearby Building 7. Thermite itself dates back to 1893. It is a mixture of aluminum and rust powder, which react to create intense heat. The reaction produces iron, heated to 2,500 degrees centigrade. This can be used to do welding. It can also be used to melt other iron. So in nanothermite, this powder from 1893 is reduced to tiny particles perfectly mixed. When these react, the intense heat develops much more quickly. Nanothermite can be mixed with additives to give off intense heat or serve as a very effective explosive. It contains more energy than dynamite and can be used as rocket fuel. Richard Gage is one of hundreds of credentialed architects and structural engineers who have put their careers on the line to point out the detailed anomalies and many implications of controlled demolition in the building collapses. As he puts it bluntly, once you get to the science, it's indisputable. So what happened to the steel debris from the World Trade Center that might have backed this up? Well, for the most part, it was shipped overseas. The removal by 4 companies contracted by the city was carefully controlled and monitored. The building assessment performance team wasn't allowed to take samples. One firefighter I spoke with who got dug out of the rubble on 9/11 said, "The one thing that always troubled me is, why were they in such a hurry to remove all the evidence? Why did they take away everything from the site as fast and expediently as possible?" I tried to talk to someone from the 9/11 Commission, but got turned down multiple times. They simply said, "We stand by our report." I also tried to speak with Mayor Giuliani, but he refused also. We recently learned through the DA of Manhattan's testimony in a court case that the city of New York did nothing to investigate 9/11. That tells me Giuliani was nothing but a straw man. Why is he paraded around as this big hero when he really had nothing to do with it, other than be a figurehead? Again, I ask, what happened to state and local laws? Homicides are supposed to be investigated by the jurisdiction where they happen. Who has the power to suspend all those laws and make them irrelevant, turning it into an investigation completely controlled by the feds? Seems that they feel they're above us. We work now for the government, not the other way around. That's not the way this country was founded. I think we have a right to know who ran that investigation so we can properly critique it. I wanted to ask Mayor Giuliani specifically about the collapse of Building 7, late on the afternoon of the attacks. If all these buildings are falling as a result of fires, shouldn't we be changing the way we build them? In this case, you had Building 7 that wasn't struck by anything. I went to the BBC and got the footage where a reporter is standing in front of it. incongruously saying that it's already come down almost a half hour before it did. I tried to talk to the reporter, but the BBC turned me down, explaining that that day was extremely hectic and they're not part of any conspiracy. A few hours before the attack, for some reason, Building 7's alarm system went on test status. The power was shut off, and all tenants evacuated after the second plane hit. People were reporting major fires on the east, north, and west faces that covered about 6 of the floors. One witness, Michael Hess, reported a major explosion on the 6th floor and being trapped for 90 minutes 2 floors above that, until he was rescued by the fire department. Well, just like the Twin Towers, the 47-story Building 7 fell symmetrically into its own footprint in 6.5 seconds, sending the same type of pyroclastic cloud down the surrounding streets that demolition is known to cause. Keep in mind that other nearby buildings with much worse damage never collapsed. Not Building 3, which was split in half by the South Tower's debris. Not Building 4, otherwise almost completely destroyed. Not Buildings 5 or 6, which suffered severe fires and structure damage. And they were much smaller than Building 7, where 81 columns all had to collapse at the same time due to fires on just a few floors. So why did Building 7 come down as it did? What's being covered up? I've got questions about the attack on the Pentagon also. Getting back to Charles Lewis and what he heard that morning on the walkie-talkies out at LAX. The security guards referred to a missile having hit the Pentagon. I was kind of puzzled, Lewis says, because by the time the airport had been evacuated and I got home, the missile that had hit the Pentagon had mysteriously changed to being another plane. I couldn't figure that out, because I didn't take the FBI or the L.A. World Airport Police to be putting on a pageant for me. Of course, officially, it was American Airlines Flight 77 that crashed into the ground floor at 9:37 a.m. Only a section of the Pentagon that had been reinforced to withstand a terrorist attack was hit. Anywhere else, the damage and the casualties would have been much worse. Left behind by a plane some 100 feet wide was a hole 16 feet deep, but no evidence to accompany it, which is something that former Air Force fighter pilot Russ Wittenberg says he'd never seen happen. Captain Wittenberg also says that jet engines do not leave a trail of white smoke, as was seen at the Pentagon. We don't know what it was, but you can tell what it wasn't, according to Wittenberg. And he believes it wasn't a 757 aircraft. Another doubter is Major General Albert Stubblebine, retired commanding general of the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, who was responsible for the Army's strategic intelligence sources worldwide. I have had a lot of experience looking at photographs, Stubblebine says. I don't know exactly what hit it, the Pentagon, but I do know from photographs I have analyzed it was not an airplane. For one thing, if you look at the hole that was made in the Pentagon, the nose penetrated far enough so that there should have been wing marks on the side of the building. One person counteracted my theory and said, "Oh, you've got it all wrong. The airplane came across, one wing hit the ground and broke off," which is possible, but if I understand airplanes correctly, most of them have 2 wings, so there should have been a mark for the second one. Stubblebine also believes the Twin Towers were brought down by a controlled demolition. How could a Boeing 757, with its engines extending beneath its wings, have struck the Pentagon so low without damaging the lawn and destroying the large cable spools on the ground in front of the damaged area? Asks 9/11 expert David Ray Griffin, a California professor and the author of 8 books exploring the contradictions of the official 9/11 story. Griffin also cites the observation of Karen Kwiatkowski, then an Air Force lieutenant colonel employed at the Pentagon, who saw no airplane metal or cargo debris. Here's what troubled me. The law was immediately and completely broken there. They had military personnel out on the lawn cleaning everything up before an investigator ever arrived. Those hasty cleanups now seem to be standard operating procedure when it comes to assassinations and events like 9/11, don't they? Whenever there's a plane crash, things are strewn about. So where are the seats, the luggage? The wings, vertical stabilizers, and engines were never fully recovered. A number of parts to a 757 are pretty much indestructible, but not a single piece has ever been positively identified as originating with Flight 77. The Department of Justice has admitted to having 85 videos, but they've been refused a Freedom of Information Act request to release them. Another expert we communicated with is Colonel George Nelson, who during 30 years of commissioned service in the Air Force served as an Aircraft Accident Investigation Board member. Colonel Nelson says, "With all the evidence readily available at the Pentagon crash site, any unbiased, rational investigator could only conclude that a Boeing 757 did not fly into the Pentagon as alleged. In all my years of direct and indirect participation, I never witnessed nor even heard of an aircraft loss where the wreckage was accessible that prevented investigators from finding enough hard evidence to positively identify the make, model, and specific registration number of the aircraft, and in most cases the precise cause of the accident." Then there's the background on the pilot. His name was Charles "Chick" Burlingame, and he was not only well-schooled in martial arts, but a retired Top Gun pilot, the best of the best. All his friends said there's no way he'd give up his plane. It wasn't in the man's makeup. Unless the hijackers got to him and killed him. But with box cutters? Supposedly a hijacker named Hanjor got control of the plane, except later his flight instructor described Hanjor as barely being able to handle a single-engine Cessna a month earlier. And Flight 77 is said to have made a complicated 330-degree turn, dropping 7,000 feet, executing a maneuver that experienced pilots say is nearly impossible. The section of the Pentagon that was struck happened to be the headquarters for naval operations and intelligence, as well as housing quite a few accountants and budget analysts. Important Pentagon financial information disappeared in the aftermath of the attack, so it's quite a coincidence that just the day before, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld had announced publicly, "According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions." That's right, not million, not even billion. That was trillion. Flight 77 disappeared from the FAA radar screen at 8:56 a.m. when it made an unauthorized turn to the south, somewhere near the Kentucky-Ohio border. The only evidence that the plane was still flying and headed toward Washington were 2 phone calls that Ted Olson said he received from his wife Barbara on board, not long before the Pentagon strike. Ted Olson was a longtime Republican operative who spearheaded the legal effort for Bush in Florida after the disputed 2000 election, and then went to work in the Justice Department as Solicitor General. His wife was the only person who is reported to have mentioned box cutters. According to Olson, she said that all passengers and flight personnel, including the pilots, were herded to the back of the plane by armed hijackers. Yup, 60-some people, including a weightlifter pilot, being held off by a few short, slender guys holding knives and box cutters. At first, Olson said the calls were made from Barbara's cell phone, except high-altitude cell phone calls were pretty much impossible in 2001. Olson then changed his story to claim she'd used an onboard phone to make a collect call, except American Airlines didn't have such phones on the Boeing 757s. Here's what the FBI reported in 2006 at the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker. Barbara Olson made only one call, an unconnected call that lasted 0 seconds. So what's going on? Captain Wittenberg has said that if Flight 77 was actually off the radar screen for 36 minutes, then it was no longer airborne. Did it land in some remote field, while something else, maybe the missile Charles Lewis heard about at LAX, hit the Pentagon's financial records area? This probably sounds far-fetched, if not crazy, until you consider that elements of our military had an eerily similar plan ready to roll back in the early 1960s. It was called Operation Northwoods, first described in a book published in 2001, Body of Secrets by James Bamford. Operation Northwoods was approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for action against Castro's Cuba, what may be the most corrupt plan ever created by the U.S. government, as Bamford put it. The Kennedy brothers seemed to be going soft on Castro, so the generals came up with a number of terrorist schemes to launch a war. Bamford tells us, among the most elaborate schemes was to create an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with the selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone, a remotely controlled unmanned aircraft. Takeoff times of the drone aircraft and the actual aircraft will be scheduled to allow a rendezvous south of Florida. From the rendezvous point, the passenger-carrying aircraft will descend to minimum altitude and go directly into an auxiliary field at Eglin Air Force Base, where arrangements will have been made to evacuate the passengers and return the aircraft to its original status. The drone aircraft, meanwhile, will continue to fly the filed flight plan. When over Cuba, the drone will be transmitting on the internal distress frequency a Mayday message stating he is under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission will be interrupted by destruction of the aircraft, which will be triggered by radio signal. If you're interested, you can read the whole plan on the website of the National Security Archive. Now let's examine the anomalies around the last plane, United Airlines Flight 93, that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, reportedly at 10:03 a.m. and 20 minutes away from Washington. The official story made me proud to be an American. The passengers overcame the hijackers and sacrificed their lives so that others might be spared. Back to Charles Lewis again at LAX that morning. They said fighter jets had been scrambled from 2 different military bases and that they had shot down the plane over Pennsylvania. And that was way before we got the hero story. The first news reports expressed surprise at how little debris was visible at the crash site. The Pennsylvania State website even said it was hard to believe that a 757 plunged into the ground with such force that it literally disintegrated and created a still smoldering crater in the ground. Then 5 days later, CNN News reported, apparently another debris site that had been cordoned off 6 to 8 miles away. This, the commentator said, raises a number of questions. Why? Could it have blown that far away? The FBI immediately took over the investigation, and for a long time wouldn't honor family members' requests, asking if they could listen to the cockpit voice recorder. This was finally allowed on April 18, 2002, provided they'd agree not to reveal anything about what they heard. And for some reason, the last 3 minutes weren't on there. Barry Lichty, the mayor of the nearby town of Indian Lake, says he heard what sounded like a missile fire that morning. The military did admit some years later that it was tracking Flight 93, and a Colonel Robert Marr recalled hearing that we will take lives in the air to preserve lives on the ground. He then ordered the air controllers to have fighter jets intercept the plane, but supposedly the commercial flight crashed before that could happen. Of course, we never fired upon the plane, said Dick Cheney. We just witnessed an act of heroism. The official story is that for the first time in history, the black boxes were not recovered, not from any of the 4 planes. For the TV pilot I did about 9/11 on True TV, we spoke to a guy who knew about the existence of 3 black boxes. He physically saw one, and his partner saw 2 more. He says they were taken away in a black government van. Another thing I find interesting, also for the first time in history, no attempt was made to reconstruct the planes with whatever parts they could find. They even did this with TWA Flight 800 that went down in 1996 in the Atlantic, and for that they had to dive down 1,200 feet. After Pearl Harbor, General Martin Short and some admirals were fired because of their alleged negligence. After 9/11, not a single employee at the FAA or NORAD got punished. In fact, all the major military men involved received promotions. They included General Richard Myers, who was named chairman of the Joint Chiefs on October 1st. The way I see it, with all the advance warnings about a terrorist attack, a fair number of Bush's team should have gotten the axe. Except right up to the president himself, it was all about denial. Here was Bush in 2004. Had I any inkling whatsoever that the people were going to fly airplanes into buildings, we would have moved heaven and earth to save the country. Here was Rumsfeld testifying before the 9/11 Commission. I knew of no intelligence during the 6+ months leading up to September 11th to indicate terrorists would hijack commercial airlines, use them as missiles to fly into the Pentagon or the World Trade Center towers. And here was Condoleezza Rice. This kind of analysis about the use of airplanes as weapons actually was never briefed to us. Oh, really? What about the intelligence briefing Bush received on August 6, 2001, that was headed, Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S., and even mentioned possible hijackings? Or Condi Rice being warned about Al-Qaeda's plotting by then CIA Director George Tenet on July 10, 2001, but brushing him off. The 9/11 Commission was aware of this, but decided to leave it out of their report. The CIA's counterintelligence chief, J. Cofer Black, later felt there were things the Commission wanted to know about and things they didn't want to know about. Rice responded, "What I am quite certain of is that I would remember if I was told, as this account apparently says, that there was about to be an attack in the United States, and the idea that I would somehow have ignored that I find incomprehensible." Seems she stammered over her words a little. These were far from the only warnings. Israel sent 2 senior agents of the Mossad to Washington in August 2001 to alert the CIA and FBI to the existence of a cell of as many as 200 terrorists said to be preparing a big operation. 8 months before the attacks, French intelligence warned the U.S. in 9 different reports about airplane hijacking plans by radical Islamists connected to Bin Laden and the Taliban. FBI agents working out of the Minneapolis and Phoenix offices tried to alert their superiors. Dr. Park Godfrey, an associate professor of computer science at Toronto's York University, said under oath in a New York courtroom that a longtime associate of his, Susan Lindauer, warned him several times, and as late as August 2001, that we expected a major attack on the southern part of Manhattan, and that the attack would encompass the World Trade Center, an attack that would involve airplanes and possibly a nuclear weapon. Lindauer, who says she was a CIA asset, claimed to have made an attempt to inform John Ashcroft at the Justice Department, who referred her to the Office of Counterterrorism. Which brings us to the whole question of the 19 alleged hijackers. Did you ever wonder how our government came up with their identities so fast? Even before the last plane crashed, the FBI was telling counterterrorism official Richard Clark they had a list of the names. It took 2 years to get indictments on the Lockerbie bombing, but not this time. except on September 16th, one of the supposed hijackers walked into the consulate in Saudi Arabia. He was actually a pilot for Saudi Airlines. On September 22nd, one of the Flight 11 hijackers announced he was alive and well. 2 more Saudi pilots did the same thing the next day. On September 27th, CBS found hijacker Hamzi, Flight 77, working for an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia. No matter, all these guys are still on the list today as being among the perpetrators. What evidence do we have then? 2 days after the attacks, our government said it was clear-cut that Osama bin Laden was the man behind it all, and that the Taliban in Afghanistan would soon be handing over its proof. 10 more days went by, at which time Colin Powell said he'd soon show us the documentation. Meantime, in 3 separate statements, bin Laden denied any involvement. On December 13th, the State Department released a video purporting to show him describing the attacks, but before long a lot of people were questioning whether it was authentic. On the day after Christmas, a Taliban official said he'd attended Osama's funeral, but on the 27th of December came a bin Laden video praising al-Qaeda's successful hit on us. Another couple of years went by before a third tape surfaced, October 29, 2004, a few days before the presidential election. Think heightened terror alert, with a blatant taking of full responsibility. However, as of June 6, 2006, the FBI said it had no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. He's been charged with several crimes related to terrorist attacks, but not with 9/11. I find that very odd. Not one shred of evidence produced in a courtroom that leads to the conclusion bin Laden spearheaded these attacks. The justice system that works for anything else is suddenly suspended over terrorism. We are led to believe that a hijacker's passport flew out of his pocket when his plane hit the tower, made it safely through 9,000 gallons of jet fuel, and landed to be found on a sidewalk 1,000 feet below. Another hijacker's ID supposedly turned up in the Pentagon wreckage, one of the few pieces that survived. Meantime, awaiting discovery in rental cars left behind at Boston Logan and Washington Dulles airports was enough evidence to convict, had they lived, an Arabic flight manual, a check made out to a Phoenix flight school, maps of Washington and New York, and more. Does this remind anyone else of Oswald leaving behind a paper trail to his purchase of the rifle, or James Earl Ray depositing his bundle full of incriminating evidence near the scene of the crime? Alleged hijacker Mohammed Atta was first said to have left a rented Mitsubishi at Boston Logan, but that story was later changed into a blue or silver Nissan left in Portland, Maine. Didn't seem to matter which vehicle, because both were said to be filled with box cutters and other incriminating items. These guys were all made out to be fanatic, Quran-toting Muslims ready to die for Allah in a holy war against America. Except in their final days, according to people who knew them, they were drinking, visiting strip clubs, soliciting prostitutes, and watching porno on the tube. Atta's girlfriend said he liked to snort cocaine. Atta seemed to be all over the place before 9/11, doing coke in Hollywood, Florida, living in Venice, Florida, near the NSA, and in Hamburg, Germany. Who some of the hijackers were really working for, at least once upon a time, first came out in Media Tidbits. From Newsweek, September 15, 2001. U.S. military sources have given the FBI information that suggests 5 of the alleged hijackers of the planes that were used in the terror attacks received training at secure U.S. military installations in the 1990s. Same day. New York Times. The Defense Department said Mr. Atta had gone to the International Officers School at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Mr. Al-Omari to the Aerospace Medical School at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, and Mr. Al-Ghamdi to the Defense Language Institute at the Presidio in Monterey, California. Well, our military's School of the Americas once helped train the Central American death squads, so our providing lethal skills to terrorists, freedom fighters, shouldn't come as a huge surprise. But it gets stranger still. 2 of the alleged hijackers rented an apartment from and actually lived with FBI informants. The CIA had operational interest in 2 of them, Nawaz al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midar. FBI agents believed that the agency was protecting Midhar and Hazmi because it hoped to recruit them, or, alternatively, that the CIA was running a joint venture with Saudi intelligence using them. The CIA goes way back with these guys. They were recruited into the secret war against the Soviets in Afghanistan back in the late 1980s. In fact, the term Al-Qaeda is said to have been invented by the CIA to designate a database of recruits into the Mujahideen. Michael Springman was head of the visa section at our embassy in Jeddah from 1987 to 1989, and he remembers granting visas to terrorists who'd been recruited by CIA and sent for training to America. Some of them fought in Bosnia during the 92 to 95 period. Springman can be seen in the documentary Zero, saying that many of the hijackers he read about in the LA Times were once on his visa list in Jeddah. He called the FBI a number of times, who, Springman says, responded, "We'll get back to you." 6 years later, I'm still waiting. Osama bin Laden himself started out helping the CIA in Afghanistan. In 2009, a former FBI translator named Sibel Edmonds dropped a bombshell. The U.S., she said, had kept up intimate relations with bin Laden all the way until that day of September 11th, using him sometimes for ops in Central Asia, including Xinjiang, China. The process Edmonds outlined involved the use of Turkey, with assistance of actors from Pakistan and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia, as proxies, with those folks in turn employing bin Laden and the Taliban. The goals? Control of the huge energy supplies in Central Asia, for one. Maybe the real reason we invaded Afghanistan? Sibel Edmonds testified for 3.5 hours to the 9/11 Commission, but it ended up being classified. Bin Laden, like 15 of the 19 alleged hijackers, came from Saudi Arabia. Back in October 2003, an article in Vanity Fair had questioned the FBI's letting 6 planes of Middle Eastern nationals, most of them members of the Saudi royal family, fly out of the U.S. soon after 9/11. The 9/11 Commission concluded that, after the Saudi government requested this out of fear for their safety, the FBI had conducted a satisfactory screening of Saudi nationals who left the United States. But one of those planes stopped 4 times at different locations around the U.S. on September 19th, picking up half-siblings and other bin Laden relatives who supposedly had no connection to him. Finally, in 2007, a heavily censored FBI report said the plane was chartered either by the Saudi Arabian royal family or Osama bin Laden. Osama? You mean to tell me the ringleader of the 9/11 attacks might have been chartering a plane on our soil 8 days after this happened? It just gets curiouser and curiouser, in the words of Lewis Carroll from Alice in Wonderland. FBI Director Robert Mueller testified about how the terrorists managed to finance themselves, saying that they'd had all their money wired in small amounts to avoid being detected. Except it came out that General Mahmoud Ahmad, the head of Pakistan's ISI intelligence service, had ordered one of his agents to wire transfer $100,000 to Mohammed Atta. The ISI and the CIA's relationship dates back to the 1980s, when the Mujahideen got set up. Ahmad, as it happened, had come to Washington a week before the attacks for a meeting with CIA Chief George Tenet and some people from Bush's National Security Council. When the story came out about the wire transfer to Atta, Ahmad abruptly retired from the ISI. The families of many 9/11 victims have gone to court seeking evidence of the Saudi royal family's bankrolling of al-Qaeda. Senator Bob Graham wrote a book that discussed the 28-page section about Saudi Arabia that the CIA, FBI, and NSA had blacked out of his committee's report. In the book, Graham noted ties between the hijackers and the Saudis and flatly stated that the White House was directing the cover-up to protect America's relationship with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Ever heard of an Army project called Able Danger? It was established in 1999 as part of the Defense Department's Special Operations Command, SOCOM. According to Colonel Anthony Schaefer, a leading member of the team with the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, Able Danger was an offensive counterterrorism project which was designed to take and kill, the military term is reduce, senior al-Qaeda leadership. It wasn't long before the Able Danger Squad uncovered al-Qaeda cells in the New York City area, one of whose members was Mohammed Atta. At least 6 witnesses later recalled seeing Atta's picture on a chart they'd drawn up back in January 2000. Turns out 3 more of the alleged hijackers had been ID'd by Able Danger before 9/11 as well. Colonel Schaefer worked closely with Navy Captain Scott Philpott and says he attempted to set up a meeting between Philpott's superior officer and FBI counterterrorism agents in D.C., so they could work together on following these cells. But 3 times the SOCOM lawyers kept a meeting from happening. Soon after that, Schaefer got transferred to a DIA project in Latin America. Then, after 9/11, he and Philpott tried to bring the story forward to Congress and the 9/11 Commission. In June 2005, a reporter for a small-town Pennsylvania paper wrote a piece that opened with, 2 years before the September 11, 2001 attacks, U.S. intelligence officials linked Mohammed Atta to al-Qaeda and discovered he and 2 others were in Brooklyn. You might think the national media would have jumped all over that, but they didn't. Eventually, the New York Times did a few stories, but when the 9/11 Commission came up with reasons for leaving Able Danger out of its report, the media nodded off again. Chairman Thomas Kane went so far as to say that the recollections of the intelligence officers cannot be verified by any document. Hence, it didn't happen. And the Pentagon wouldn't let Schaefer or anyone else testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee. We talked to Schaefer while putting together this chapter. In his opinion, both the Clinton and Bush administrations were covering up their incompetence. The Department of Defense does not want to get blamed for making bad decisions, which resulted in information not being passed to the FBI and therefore being a material factor in why 9/11 happened, he told us. That's why you had DOD coming after me, because I blew the whistle. DOD has admitted there are 10,000-plus Able Danger documents, but they won't release a single one. To me, that's bizarre, because most of the targeting information was done on the open Internet and completely unclassified. It does cause you to wonder. 9/11 expert David Ray Griffin concluded that the Commission and the Pentagon were covering up dangerous information that suggested Atta was being protected. When we combine this observation with other things we have learned about the alleged hijackers, including the money reportedly sent to Atta by the CIA-created Pakistani ISI, the Able Danger evidence provides additional reason to suspect that the hijackers were really paid assets. A think tank, called the Project for the New American Century, composed mainly of right-wing ideologues, wrote a report pre-9/11 titled Building America's Defenses. The document contains this line: "The process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor." We all know the results of 9/11. 2 unending wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964? We were told that American ships were attacked by the North Vietnamese. Now we know that the incident was manufactured by the Pentagon in order to gain support for escalating the Vietnam War. If the United States government was prepared to stage such a gargantuan event in leading our nation to war, then why would they refrain from doing so again today? Might we look at this as a trend, going into these wars under false pretenses? Richard A. Clarke, National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism at the time, wrote in 2009 that Iraq was a move that many senior Bush officials had wanted to make before 9/11. While the Pentagon was still burning, Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld was in the White House suggesting an attack against Baghdad, despite being repeatedly told that Iraq was not involved in 9/11. Some, like Cheney, could not abandon the idea. The 9/11 Commission report states that the Bush administration had repeatedly tied the Iraq War to September 11th. The panel finds no al-Qaeda-Iraq tie. Bush then did some backpedaling, saying, "This administration never said that the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. We did say there were numerous contacts." Meetings, it turned out, between bin Laden and Iraqi intelligence that took place in Sudan back in the mid-1990s. But one prisoner, Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, was tortured in 2002 until he'd agreed to say that al-Qaeda was linked to Saddam. He died suddenly after being transferred from Egypt to another prison in Libya. The 9/11 Commission was a whitewash from the front, after Bush and Cheney had stonewalled an investigation for more than a year. The fellow named as the first commission chairman was none other than Henry Kissinger, who said no thank you on December 13, 2002, when told that he'd have to disclose his list of private business clients. Kissinger was also busy advising the Bush administration on how best to go into Iraq. The commission's executive director ended up being Philip Zelikow, who got a jump on the game by putting together a detailed outline of the final report just as they were starting to investigate. The outline was kept secret from others on the 80-member staff. Zelikow decided everything. After all, back in 1998, he'd co-written an essay on catastrophic terrorism, which he foresaw would be a watershed event in American history. Like Pearl Harbor, this event would divide our past and future into a before and after. The United States might respond with draconian measures, scaling back civil liberties, allowing wider surveillance of citizens, detention of suspects, and use of deadly force. Sound familiar? Zelikow had also been principal author of a paper aimed at justifying a preemptive strike on Iraq, and he tried without success to insert a sentence into the report suggesting repeated communication between al-Qaeda and Iraq. Zelikow happened to leave off his resume the fact that at Condi Rice's request he'd been part of the Bush transition team. But then he'd co-authored a book with Rice, too. Zelikow engaged in surreptitious communications with Karl Rove in the course of the investigation. With Zelikow running the show, there was no hope that the commission would carry out an impartial investigation. It recently came out that there were minders from Bush's team sitting there with the witnesses, answering questions for them and positioning themselves physically in an intimidating manner. The 9/11 Commission politely informs us that conspiracy theories play a peculiar role in American discourse. Whenever there is a particularly surprising, traumatic, and influential moment in our history, people are left with unsettling questions. As an example, they go on to cite conspiracy theorists who propagate outrageous notions that Kennedy was assassinated by the CIA or some shadowy secret society of the rich and powerful. Outrageous notions? I find it outrageous that yet another government-appointed commission allows itself to become part of the cover-up, especially when they knew damn well that's what they were doing. The 10-member commission, in a secret meeting at the end of its tenure in summer 2004, debated referring the matter to the Justice Department for criminal investigation, according to several commission sources. Staff members and some commissioners thought that emails and other evidence provided enough probable cause to believe that military and aviation officials violated the law by making false statements to Congress and to the Commission. The 9/11 Commission's chairman, Thomas Kane, and Vice Chair Lee Hamilton have since come out and said, "The recent revelations that the CIA destroyed videotape interrogations of Qaeda operatives leads us to conclude that the agency failed to respond to our lawful requests for information about the 9/11 plot. Those who knew about those videotapes and did not tell us about them obstructed our investigation." Now we know from the new book by senior counsel John Farmer that almost every person involved in the official version of 9/11 lied about the events of that day. Our country has changed since 9/11. We've been frightened into half the people saying torture's okay now if it prevents terrorism. Americans are marching in the streets to try to stop someone who's sick from going to the doctor. But where is the outcry now that it's been proven that the whole Iraq war was trumped up? Maybe something stopped in us all on 9/11, and we're stuck back there collectively and can't truly move forward until we have a new independent investigation to get to the bottom of what really happened. The 9/11 Truth Movement has a growing of groups: political leaders, architects and engineers, firefighters, lawyers, medical professionals, pilots, religious leaders, scholars, scientists, journalists, and other media and veterans. Check them out online. Get involved, as I have. But if you challenge the status quo, be prepared for retaliation. That's what seems to have happened to Charles Lewis, the man with whom we began this chapter's revelations. After he noticed another lapse at LAX as a quality control manager, this time observing a Saudi Airlines 747 disembark a host of passengers into the cargo area, his security clearance got revoked. He's currently unemployed. What should we do now? When enough people came to question the Warren Commission, the door was opened for Congress to do a further investigation and come to a different conclusion about the Kennedy assassination. That should be precedent enough, now that it's become clear the 9/11 Commission was a whitewash, for Americans to call for a new and honest investigation into the greatest attack ever perpetrated on our soil. Was our own government asleep at the switch, or might it even have played a role in what happened? It's time to demand an answer, as independent truth-seeking groups from many walks of life are already calling for.